Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. As I am listening to this story, I am reminded of how when I was a little boy in Sunday school, how I would have learned this story. There would have been a felt board on an easel, and the teacher would have stuck little pieces of paper with that little sticky back on them up onto the green felt board. And there would have been a little picture of a little boy laying on his back, and picture of probably an old priest laying on his back, and this whole interaction between the priest and the young boy. And I'm sure that a lot of Sunday school teachers appreciate this story, and I like to teach it to little kids because it seems to be very appropriate, doesn't it? Samuel is a little boy, and he is being called by God. But what do you do if you're in that experience yourself? It's easy to see that it was the Word of God in hindsight, but in that moment, how would you know that? What would you think about that? I'm reminded how later in the Bible there's a confrontation in the book of Jeremiah between two prophets. One prophet, Jeremiah, predicts that the Babylonians will destroy Jerusalem, and the other prophet predicts that God will save Jerusalem. Again, what would you do in the moment? How do you listen to the voice? Because it isn't until years later that it becomes evident who truly was a prophet of God. So what do you do when you hear a strange voice calling? Who do you assume that it is? Now, Samuel is an important character in the Hebrew Bible. He is a bit of a bridge figure. Because before Samuel, you have the book of Judges and the time of the Judges. That was a period in ancient Israel's history where there was no central government. Instead, it was a loose tribal confederacy. Shiloh was the central shrine of the Lord, and God alone was understood to be the king. Loose alliances formed and broke. They were based on the needs of the time and built around family and tribal connections. And charismatic leaders would be appointed by God to serve for a time. And these would often come and go as the needs arose, often because of conflicts. And you read that as you read the book of Judges. It's all about this conflict arose, and so this judge arose to fight it. This conflict arose, and this judge was appointed to fight it. So these charismatic leaders would come and go as the needs arose. And in that context, Samuel is really understood as the last of the judges, looking back. But you also have looking forward from the time of Samuel. And as you read 1st and 2nd Samuel and then 1st and 2nd Kings, you read about the rise of kings and you read about the rise of a new position called the prophet. Because now we've moved into the time of prophets and kings. Power is increasingly centralized into the hands of the king, and rather than having charismatic leadership, you have dynastic succession, where fathers are succeeded by their sons, who are then succeeded by their sons. Max Weber would call this the routinization of charisma, in case you're interested. Where you have the transition from a time when leaders are charismatic to where you realize you can't rely on charismatic leaders anymore. You have to have institutions. And that's the transition that you see at work here in the Hebrew Bible. The capital city starts to become a thing. Right now, there is no capital, right? But eventually Jerusalem becomes the capital in the south and Samaria becomes the capital in the north. And we see prophets becoming more and more important. They anoint kings, and if God wills it, they also remove kings. The kings now are the ones who exercise military and political power, and the prophets serve as the conscience of the nation. And that's what we see going forward from Samuel. So in this sense, you could see Samuel is not just the last of the judges, but he's really also the first of the prophets. So what do we know about this character, Samuel? Well, in many ways, Samuel's story is a very familiar one, because it involves a man with multiple wives, where one of his wives is his beloved wife, and one of his wives is the wife that he doesn't really love very much. It's always sad that the Bible spends so much time focusing on the wives who their husbands preferred. What about the poor wives that are married and aren't preferred? Because again, in this story, Hannah, who is the preferred wife, is barren. Again, a theme that is very common in the Hebrew Bible, that the beloved wife does not have children. Meanwhile, her sister wife is very fertile and has had lots of children. And poor Hannah, because in that ancient world, a woman's value was really determined by her ability to produce a male heir for her husband. Poor Hannah ends up being a bit of a laughingstock in her community. Her sister wife makes fun of her, and she really just desires to have a son. And so she goes to Shiloh, to the sacred shrine where the Ark of the Covenant is, and she prays earnestly for a son. And she promises God that if she receives a son, that she will commit him to the Lord. And in fact, she does become pregnant. And when her son is old enough, she takes him to the temple, well, not to the temple. The temple isn't there yet, but to the ancient shrine where the tabernacle is. And he is raised in the temple, in the religious community. And that is where we meet him now today. He is growing up in the precincts of the tabernacle under the care of Eli, the high priest. And while he is sleeping one night, he hears a voice in the dark, and he thinks it is his mentor Eli. And 3 times he goes to Eli and says, I'm here, I'm here. And of course, 3 times Eli tells him, I am not calling you, boy. Finally, of course, the 3rd time, Eli realizes that something else is happening here. Something far more than the mundane interaction between a mentor and his mentee. Eli realizes that God is calling the boy. And so he tells the boy, the next time you hear God call to you, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. It seems like an innocent thing to say, isn't it? But it doesn't turn out to be very innocent, does it? Because what does poor Samuel immediately get told? That God is going to exact justice on Eli, his beloved mentor. And that Eli and his entire family are going to be killed because of their sins. This is not the kind of message that you want to have as a little child. Heck, it's not a message you want as an adult to be told. But the message is one about change. Because you have the house of the high priest Eli, and you see that it is passing away. Also, Shiloh will soon cease to be the location of the Ark of the Covenant and cease to be the holy shrine that the Israelites go to. And not too far down in the book, Samuel will be called upon to appoint first Saul as king, and then later David after God rejects Saul. So change is in the air. And poor young Samuel is the one who's being called upon to stand right in the middle of that change. Young Samuel is the one being given a message that is not going to be easy to deliver. We see certain basic themes here in this story. The call is, of course, central here. But we notice that the call is often unexpected. It's unexpected in a couple of ways. The first one is, of course, timing. Isn't God a sensible God who knows better than to interrupt people while they're sleeping? Apparently not. God can call you in the middle of the night. The other thing is that who God is calling apparently is also something unexpected. Here you have this young boy, and he's the one that God is calling here. He is an unlikely candidate to be called by God. He's just a boy. And not even a boy from some great family or anything like that. He's just an ordinary boy. We also see that the call is not always easy. Sometimes the call will ask us to do something that we don't want to do, or at the very least is something that we are uncomfortable doing. Sometimes it pushes us out of our comfort zones. Sometimes it calls on us to do things that we never thought that we could do. But other times the call isn't so much something hard to do, but it's often something difficult to say. A hard message, a hard truth. In this case, it is a message to his mentor, reminding him that although he is high priest, ultimately he serves at the pleasure of God, and that there are consequences for his actions. And that, unfortunately, is another theme that we see over and over again. In fact, this story of Eli is familiar because later in Samuel's life, we also find out that Samuel also has sons who end up doing corrupt things and polluting the community. So it turns out that sometimes leaders can't always have good kids. But then again, you're all parents. You know that already. You have some good kids and some bad kids. But that's a challenging message that poor Samuel is called upon to bring. But the last part is that this call, however, can bring about new life. Because ultimately, despite what it may look like, this call of God reflects ultimately the gracious actions of God, even though it may not always look like it at the time. Having to do something that you're uncomfortable with or afraid to do, having to say something that you don't want to say, may not seem like a good thing in the time. But ultimately, God's call comes out of God's love and God's grace. As I mentioned earlier, Samuel was living in an important time of transition. The old tribal confederation form of government was passing away, and soon Israel would have a king like so many of the nations of the earth. That idealistic time where the tribes lived together in equality and served God communally is coming to an end. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you ask, Israel is now going to have a king. And it is Samuel that presides over that transition. And of course, the biblical writers are not entirely sure whether or not that's a good thing or not. Scholars kind of go back and forth on that, because it appears that at some time, the biblical writer is very clear that they do not think kings are good. That instead they prefer leadership something more like the judges of old or the prophets. But then every so often they put in things about the king that sounds like, well, maybe on the other hand they do like kings. I mean, David gets pretty favorable press in the history as written, although he's one of the few kings that do. So we also, not unlike the nation of Israel at that time, are also in a time of transition. Not just because your fearless and incredibly charismatic leader is leaving you, but in reality, we've been in transition for some time, haven't we? That's always been our issue, isn't it? We have been struggling to find our way in this new age. You know, the days of old when you could open a church up and stick the little chalice on the outside, and everyone in the community who came from a disciples' family would show up at your door. Those days are gone. And it wasn't just disciples that were that way. Presbyterians, Lutherans, Congregationalists, all of the old mainline churches could do the same thing. They knew that people in the community all had these identities, and all they had to do was put up a building with the right symbol on the outside, and there people would find their way there. The trouble with that is that it was a model that only worked for a very short time in the history of the United States. You know, if you read about what were churches like 100 years ago, you find out that, oh, guess what? A lot of our churches were small, and a lot of our churches had part-time ministers. If you think about it, even this church, how late it was when the church finally decided they needed more than just a place to worship. You know, when this church was first built, it was a small little sanctuary. They made it a little bigger, and then they said, maybe we need a basement. But that all came later, right? The first building was just a little square meeting room. And so that is kind of, in a way, what we are going back to for the church. The challenge for us, of course, is that we've built not just our church, but a lot of our churches have built large buildings and large staff and all of these programs. And so we are having to transition to the point where we may not have the people or the money to maintain all of these things that we have become accustomed to. You know, if you visit different churches, so many of them tell the same story. If you walk through the buildings of those churches, you will see that there are all these classrooms. And the members will tell you, oh, that's where Mrs. Such and Such taught first grade, and that's where such and such taught second grade, and that's where third and fourth. And you realize that pretty much every grade used to have its own classroom. In some cases, more than one. That's true here at Greenacres. It's true at Viradale. It's true at the church that I'm going to serve next. And we're struggling with that. Because part of us feels like, well, gosh, what did we do wrong? Have we failed our forebears in some way because they had these big churches? Rafter stories is what one of my seminary professors called them. Rafter stories, because, we were full to the rafters, you know, with people, whether in the sanctuary or whether it was in the classrooms. Of course, you have to wonder how much of that is completely true, how much of that is nostalgia. But nevertheless, we did have a lot more people in our churches back then. And so we are in this time of transition where we used to be in that place, but we're not there anymore. We are going towards a future. We don't really know exactly what that future looks like. So whether we are like the ancient Israelites in the wilderness, standing between the time in Egypt in slavery and the time forward in the promised land, or whether we are like young Samuel, standing between the time of the ancient tribal confederacy and moving forward to a new political organization, we're standing in a time in the middle, a liminal season, where we don't really know where we're going. So what do we do in this time? Our old models don't necessarily work, and the new models have not really been developed. If you want to go out there, you can find that there are all sorts of church growth experts out there who have all these different ideas about what the church needs to do. It can be a little overwhelming because there's a lot of different ones. And which one do you pick? There's no easy answer to that because we don't actually know where we're going to be soon. We are a pilgrim people. We are wandering in the wilderness or waiting for the words of God to come and tell us what to do. And sometimes that is uncomfortable. Sometimes that is scary. But this is what we need to do. We need to listen. We need to listen for the call of God. And we need to recognize that that call may come at a time that is very inconvenient, or at least we think is inconvenient, or it might come through a person that we're like, But that person isn't elected in any office. It may come from a place that we don't expect. And other times it may be a message that is not very comfortable to us, because we're kind of used to our own ways, aren't we? And this is true for all of us. We like things in a certain way. And change is a little awkward and uncomfortable and sometimes just unpleasant for us sometimes. But change is in the air. Something new is coming. We don't know exactly what it is or what it will look like, but we know it's not going to be easy. It's going to require some difficult sacrifices on our part. But as people who seek to be faithful, as people who seek to discern the will of God, we know that we need to listen. We need to listen for that call. As I mentioned earlier, we don't always know where that call is coming from. And we do need to be careful, because there are a lot of voices out there. A lot of voices that aren't necessarily good voices. And so, like Samuel, we need to take those voices and we need to go check them out with people that we can trust, people like Eli. The beautiful thing about that story is that Eli is blind. And so clearly the writer wants us to think about him in less than positive ways. He's blind and his children are really not good. But at the same time, even Eli is able to discern the voice of God. So a trusted authority is eventually able to hear. So we check these voices out. And once we check them out and realize that, no, this is the word of the Lord, then we do it. No matter how hard it is, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. Here at Greenacres, we are in a challenging time. And it really has nothing to do with whether or not I'm here or not. It's much larger than anything that one person, any one of us, has something to do with. I might like to think that it has something to do with me, but it doesn't. Our church is simply in a time of challenge, a time of change, a time of growth, a time of evolution. It's hard for us because where we are going, although we don't know exactly what it is going to be, we know it's not going to look like what we're used to. It's not going to be easy. But then again, when did Jesus ever promise us an easy road? Listen for the voice of God. When you hear those voices, check them out. Make sure they are legit. And once they do check out, do them. Amen.